The bikers stormed into Michael Brown's workshop, their laughter echoing as they smashed tools and overturned shelves. Their leader, Jackson, sneered as he kicked over Michael's cherished motorcycle. "Give it up, old man," Jackson jeered. "This place is ours now." Michael stood calm, his steady gaze masking the storm beneath. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, too afraid to intervene, but Jackson had no idea who he was dealing with. Beneath Michael's quiet demeanor lay a power that would soon turn the tables in a way they'd never expect. What happened next was a lesson they'd never forget. Let's start from the beginning. It was one of those golden summer evenings in a peaceful American town where time seemed to slow down. Michael Brown, a man in his late 60s with sharp eyes and silver hair, stood in his small garage workshop. His hands worked deftly, polishing a wrench, every movement careful and deliberate. Nearby stood a vintage motorcycle, gleaming as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. To Michael, it wasn't just a bike, it was a time machine, a reminder of the days when he raced across highways and lived for the thrill of speed and freedom. Life was quieter now. He spent his days maintaining his workshop, tending to his small yard, and occasionally chatting with neighbors who always appreciated his kindness and calm demeanor. The serenity was shattered by the guttural growl of motorcycle engines. Michael's steady hands paused as the noise grew louder, shaking the air with its intensity. A group of bikers pulled up outside his workshop, their presence as subtle as a thunderstorm in the middle of a picnic. The leader, a tall, heavily tattooed man named Jackson, swung off his bike with exaggerated swagger. His boots hit the ground like he was stamping his authority into the earth. With a laugh loud enough to echo down the street, he sized up Michael like a predator, eyeing easy prey. "Hey there, old man," Jackson called, his grin wide and mockingly friendly. "Still tinkering with this junk? How about letting some real men take over?" Michael turned slowly, his calm gaze meeting Jackson's wild eyes. "Evening," he replied, his voice steady. "Can I help you with something?" "Yeah," Jackson said, stepping closer. "You can help by packing up and finding another hobby. This spot, it's ours now." He punctuated his claim by tearing down the neatly pinned poster advertising Michael's services. Michael's expression didn't waver, though his grip on the wrench tightened imperceptibly. "This is my workshop," he said evenly. "Maybe we could talk this over." Jackson let out a bark of laughter, gesturing to his crew. "Talk? Did you hear that, boys? Grandpa here wants to talk." The bikers hooted, their laughter blending with the idling engines of their bikes. One of them, a wiry man with a bandana, kicked over a toolbox, scattering its contents across the ground. Another spray-painted a crude image on the side of the garage, the hiss of the can cutting through the laughter. Michael stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold. The calm in his eyes didn't match the trembling in his hands as he witnessed the destruction of his meticulously maintained workshop. The sharp clang of metal hitting the floor, the smell of spray paint, and the laughter of the bikers created a surreal, almost absurd scene. "See, old man," Jackson said, leaning against the garage door he just entered. "You should be thanking us. We're saving you from wasting your time on this, whatever this is." Michael tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the havoc around him. "You've got an interesting way of offering help," he said. "Oh, I've got plenty more to offer," Jackson retorted, smirking. Across the street, a small group of neighbors peeked out from behind curtains and fences. Their faces were a mixture of fear and curiosity. They knew Michael was a kind man, but in this moment, he looked vulnerable, a lone figure standing against a rowdy, unruly gang. The bikers continued their rampage, knocking over shelves and tossing tools like they were clearing out trash. Michael didn't move, didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his stare made Jackson falter for the briefest moment. "Still standing there, huh?" Jackson sneered, recovering quickly. He picked up a wrench and tossed it carelessly into a pile of smashed tools. "Guess you don't have much fight left in you." Michael exhaled slowly, his gaze flicking to the bike they'd parked closest to the workshop. It was a sleek, customized model, clearly Jackson's pride and joy. Without a word, Michael stepped forward and began righting a fallen shelf, his movements measured. "Hey, don't ignore me," Jackson barked, the laughter of his gang faltering slightly. Michael straightened, dusted off his hands, and turned to face him. "I'm just cleaning up," he said. His tone was calm, almost unnervingly so. After all, someone has to take care of the mess. The quiet authority in his voice hung in the air, silencing the bikers momentarily. Jackson's grin faded for a second before he forced it back. "Let's see how long you can keep that attitude," Jackson muttered, motioning for his crew to follow him. "We'll be back, old man. This isn't over." As the bikes roared to life and the gang sped off, Michael stood in the center of his ruined workshop, his sharp eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Across the street, a young neighbor whispered to his mother, "Why didn't Mr. Brown stop them?" His mother shook her head. "I don't know, but something about him. He's not scared." The faint smile returned to Michael's lips as he picked up his wrench and returned it to its place. "Not over," he murmured, almost to himself. "No, it isn't." Morning sunlight streamed into Michael's workshop, but the warmth did little to ease the sting of what he saw. His tools were scattered like fallen leaves, shelves broken, and his prized posters slashed. The faint smell of spray paint still lingered in the air. He knelt beside his vintage motorcycle, assessing the damage. The bike had been his brother's, a reminder of their shared adventures on winding roads and quiet sunsets. The memory was cut short by the familiar, now dreaded, rumble of engines. The bikers returned, their numbers swelling like an invasive tide. Jackson led the pack, wearing the same overconfident smirk, but now accompanied by louder jeers and even bolder actions. "Morning, Grandpa," Jackson called out, mockery dripping from his words. "Hope you're not too busy crying over last night's mess." Michael straightened slowly, brushing off his hands. "What do you want now, Jackson?" Jackson strode up to the vintage motorcycle and placed a boot against it. "This relic? Still standing? Let's fix that." With a sudden shove, he tipped it over. The sharp crack of the headlight shattering echoed across the street. Michael moved quickly, kneeling to lift the bike. His voice was quiet but firm. "This belonged to my brother," Jackson sneered, leaning in as if to mock the sentiment further. "Your brother? Let me guess. He was a dreamer like you." "Well, dreams don't last, old man, and neither does this junk." The gang erupted in laughter, their taunts blending with the crash of metal as they overturned a workbench. One of them grabbed a can of bright red paint and sprayed a crude, dripping symbol across the workshop wall. Michael turned to reach for his phone, but before he could dial, one of the bikers snatched it out of his hand. "What are you gonna do, call for help?" the man sneered, dangling the phone mockingly before tossing it into the chaos. "You're wasting your breath," Jackson said, stepping closer. "Nobody's coming to save you. You're just an old man clinging to a pile of memories." Across the street, the neighbors had gathered again. They whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of pity and apprehension. One young man took a hesitant step forward but was pulled back by an older woman, shaking her head. "Cowards," Jackson muttered under his breath, noticing the onlookers. He raised his voice. "See, even your neighbors know you're finished here." Michael remained composed, though his jaw tightened. "You talk a lot for someone who doesn't seem to listen." "Oh, I'm all ears," Jackson shot back with a smirk. Michael bent down and picked up a fallen wrench, holding it with an almost casual air. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle some of the bikers, their laughter faltering for a split second. "You think this is funny?" Michael said, his voice low and steady. "Ruining someone's hard work, taking what doesn't belong to you?" Jackson stepped forward, towering over Michael. "I think it's hilarious," he said, "and I think you should stop wasting your breath and start packing." For a moment, silence hung in the air, broken only by the nervous shuffling of the younger bikers. Then Michael did something unexpected. He chuckled. Jackson blinked, thrown off balance by the unexpected reaction. "What's so funny?" "Oh, just you," Michael said, his voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. "You strut around like a big shot, but all I see is a man desperate for attention." The gang fell silent, their leader visibly bristling at the comment. Jackson's face darkened, but before he could respond, Michael continued. "I have dealt with men like you before," Michael said, his calm tone cutting through the tension. "And let me tell you, they never last long." Jackson narrowed his eyes, his bravado faltering for the briefest moment. "We'll see about that," he snapped, motioning for his crew to continue the destruction. As they stomped and smashed their way through the workshop, Michael stepped back, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Across the street, the neighbors watched with bated breath, their silence louder than any words. When the gang finally mounted their bikes to leave, Jackson turned back for one final taunt. "Face it, old man," he said. "This place is done for." Michael stood at the edge of the workshop, his posture straight and unwavering. As the engines roared to life, he called out, his voice carrying over the noise. "Come back tomorrow," he said, his tone unnervingly calm. "I'll be ready." The bikers hesitated, their leader giving him a wary glance before revving his engine and leading the group away. The neighbors stared at Michael, their faces a mixture of admiration and concern. "What's he planning?" one of them whispered. Michael bent down, picked up a broken wrench, and set it neatly on the counter. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He turned to the onlookers and gave a faint smile. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you have to let people show you who they really are before you deal with them." The chapter ended with Michael standing amidst the ruins of his workshop, his calm exterior belying the storm brewing within. The morning of the third day was eerily calm. The workshop stood battered but not broken. And so did Michael. As the familiar rumble of motorcycles grew louder, he stepped outside, his expression as steady as ever. The bikers arrived in full force, their numbers even greater than before. Jackson dismounted his bike with exaggerated confidence, the smirk on his face wider than ever. "Well, old man," he said, pacing toward Michael with his hands spread wide, "I hope you've come to your senses. Got those keys ready for me?" Michael leaned casually against the counter, his gaze unwavering. "Not today," he said simply. Jackson frowned, his bravado flickering for a moment. "What's this? You still think you got a chance? You're all alone here, Pops." Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached under the counter, his fingers pressing a hidden button. The faintest click was the only sound, before silence fell over the street. The bikers exchanged confused glances, their unease growing. Before anyone could say a word, the low hum of powerful engines filled the air. Around the corner came a fleet of sleek, black SUVs. They moved with military precision, stopping abruptly in front of the workshop. "What the?" one of the bikers muttered, his voice trailing off as the SUV doors opened. Out stepped men and women dressed in crisp suits, their movements efficient and deliberate. Each of them carried an air of authority that immediately made the bikers shrink back. Their leader, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes, strode forward and stopped in front of Michael. He stood at attention and gave a sharp salute. "Mr. Brown, the security team has arrived as requested," he said, his voice steady and formal. Michael returned the salute with a small nod. "Thank you, Agent Carter. I think it's time we had a conversation with our guests." The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating like mist under the morning sun. "What is this?" Jackson sputtered, his voice suddenly higher-pitched. "Who are these people?" Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather badge holder. He opened it slowly, revealing an ID that immediately silenced the gang. "My name," Michael said, his tone calm but with a sharp edge, "is Michael Brown, former director of the Regional Security Task Force. You might have heard of it." Jackson took an involuntary step back, his face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "That's not possible," he stammered. Michael took a step forward, his eyes locked on Jackson's. "I gave you more chances than you deserved," he said. "You chose to ignore them. That was your mistake." Agent Carter motioned to his team, and they moved with practiced efficiency. One by one, the bikers were restrained, their protests growing louder and more desperate. "Hey, you can't do this," Jackson yelled as two agents approached him. "This is harassment." One of the agents smirked slightly. "Harassment? Looks like you've got a lot of experience in that department." The neighbors had gathered again, but this time their fear had turned into amazement. Whispers of, "Who is he?" and "Did you know he was this important?" rippled through the crowd. Jackson, now handcuffed, glared at Michael. "You can't get away with this," he spat. Michael tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Get away with what? Protecting what's mine?" As the last of the bikers were escorted to the SUVs, Jackson made one final attempt to regain control. "You think this is over, old man? You think you've won?" Michael stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It was over the moment you underestimated me." The SUVs began to pull away, the bikers' protests muffled by the closing doors. As the street fell silent, the neighbors erupted into applause, their admiration for Michael evident. One young boy approached, his wide eyes full of wonder. "Mr. Brown, are you a secret agent?" Michael chuckled softly, ruffling the boy's hair. "Not anymore, kid. Just an old man who knows when to push back." The chapter closed with Michael standing in front of his workshop, the faint smile still on his face as the neighbors surrounded him, their questions and gratitude filling the air. The tide had turned, and justice, though delayed, had arrived in full force. The street was alive with activity as police loaded Jackson and his gang into their vehicles. The bikers, once brimming with arrogance, now looked deflated and embarrassed. Jackson, cuffed and cornered, glared at the crowd that had gathered to witness his downfall. An officer turned to Michael. Mr. Brown, care to have the last word?" Michael stepped forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Before you go, Jackson," he said, his voice steady, "there's one thing left to do. Apologize to me and to all these people." Jackson hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. After a long pause, he muttered, "Sorry." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Louder, they didn't hear you." Jackson's face turned crimson as he repeated, "I'm sorry, for everything." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers drowning out Jackson's grumbled protests as he was led away. "Michael, you're a hero," a neighbor shouted, and others chimed in with their thanks and admiration. Michael gave a modest smile. "Just a man who knows when to stand his ground," he replied, drawing more cheers. In the days that followed, Jackson's apology went viral, and Michael's story became a local sensation. The workshop was repaired with funds from the gang's restitution, and neighbors came together to help restore it. The once damaged space now felt brighter, full of life and camaraderie. One quiet evening, Michael sat in his newly restored workshop, running a hand over his brother's cherished motorcycle. The soft light reflected off its polished surface, a symbol of resilience. "Good fight, brother," he said softly, a smile touching his lips. Outside, the street was peaceful again, but the respect for Michael remained palpable. As he leaned back, savoring the calm, a neighbor knocked, offering a pie. "Thanks for showing us what real strength looks like," they said. Michael chuckled. "Strength isn't about fists. It's about knowing when to stand tall." The chapter closed with Michael at peace, a quiet beacon of courage and justice in his small corner of the world.